Welcome to the Holy Post. Two events have our attention this week. First, a new documentary about reality TV's Duggar family is exposing the ugly side of Christian fundamentalism, patriarchy, and the legalism taught by Bill Gothard's ministry. And secondly, Christian broadcaster and pillar of the religious right, Pat Robertson, died this week at age 93. What's the link between the popularity of Gothard and Robertson for a whole generation of American Christians? Then, New Testament scholar Nijay Gupta talks about his new book, Tell Her Story, How Women Led, Taught, and Ministered in the Early Church. And he participates in an unexpected therapy session with me about our shared background. All of that, plus Kaitlyn is learning German, book bans backfire on the Bible in Utah, and Phil rescues pets from fallen ministry leaders. For Holy Post Plus subscribers, we have some fantastic bonus content this week as well. First, a new episode of Christian Asks about what it really means to take the Lord's name in vain. Here's a hint, it has nothing to do with how you say his name. And we have a brilliant bonus interview with Nijay Gupta where he explains the context and meaning of 1 Timothy 2 where Paul says that he doesn't allow women to teach or have authority over men. This one will absolutely blow your minds. And for those of you who aren't yet Holy Post Plus subscribers, sorry, no blown minds for you. But it's not too late. Go to holypost.com and learn all about the amazing content, merchandise, live streams, and resources that you can access by joining Holy Post Plus. All right, here's episode 569.
Hey there, welcome back to the podcast. This is Phil Vischer. It's the Holy Post Podcast. I'm here with Skye Jitani. Hi, Skye.
Hello, Phil.
Hi. And Kaitlyn Shess. Hi, Kaitlyn.
Hi, Phil.
Hi. Skye, you're in the Black Death Star, but is that a big piece of wood behind you? Are they doing some work in the Death Star?
I made those are two leaves I made for our dining room table from wood I got at Home Depot, and they just ended up in my office.
Oh,
how handy!
I know.
Skye.
Yes, so handy.
I'm quite handy.
And are you going to finish them so it matches the finish?
No,
they're just dining room table.
They're just so we can put a tablecloth over and fit 12 people at the table.
Oh, okay. Because you keep having children, like, say, the Duggar family.
Oh, my gosh.
Oh, that's a reference coming up this week. Okay, here's the theme song. What's the news that you like the most? Who's your favorite podcast host? If it's breakfast, get your toast. It's Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. Skye and Phil and the Holy Post.
And sometimes Kaitlyn.
Today's episode is sponsored by Sundays. This is Phil. I have a dog. You have a dog. We love our dogs, and we gotta feed them something. Fresh food with human-grade ingredients is a better way to treat our dogs than that old bag of whatever that stuff is. Sawdust and cow bones? I have no idea. But fresh pet food is expensive and inconvenient, and that's where Sundays comes in. No, not the day. The new dog food company that makes air-dried dog food from a short list of human-grade ingredients. It's healthy, with beef, chicken, and digestive aids like pumpkin and ginger. It's convenient. Unlike other fresh dog foods, it's zero prep, zero mess, and zero stress. Sundays is shelf stable and ships right to your door. And it's affordable, costing 40% less than other healthy dog food brands because they don't waste money shipping frozen packages. We've got a special offer for our dog-loving Holy Posters. Get 35% off your first order of Sundays. Go to sundaysfordogs.com/holypost or use the code HOLYPOST at checkout. That's sundaysfordogs.com/holypost. Upgrade your pup to Sundays and feel good about the food you feed your dog. And thanks to Sundays for sponsoring this episode. Kaitlyn, how's your summer going? Are you learning German?
I am learning German. The good news is I don't have to learn to speak German. So everyone who asks me about it, I just am like, I can read some words, but I'm not going to say any words. But I am learning some German, yeah.
Okay, because I was just thinking it would be really fun and summery to just kind of wander around town talking German. I
think you should do that.
Me. Yeah.
That would fit your vibe.
Yeah, and hold a tiki torch while you're doing it, Phil.
Oh,
see if that draws any attention.
No, you made it awkward. But you're learning German. What else are you doing?
I'm preparing for my book to come out. That's like a lot of work.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to figure out all of the giant list of books that I will read next year for my exams.
Oh.
We basically just make this giant list of every book I should fully know, and then they will ask me questions about them.
According to whom?
Smart people smarter than me.
Oh, do they actually tell you what you need to read, or are you just supposed to know what you're supposed to read?
It's collaborative. Like, I'll be like, are these things the things I need to read? And they will give lists. Like, professors at the divinity school will give me lists, and we'll work out, like, these are the things I need to have mastered.
And are any of them German books?
No.
Okay. You're learning German to read.
What's the point of learning German?
Exactly.
I'm learning German so that if I'm like, a year into my dissertation and I discover that there's this one article written in the 19th century that no one's ever translated that I need to know, I can be the one to translate it. I'm not going to go around just reading German.
Can't you hire someone to translate it?
Like Google?
Do you think grad students are like made of money?
No, but like
there's Google Translate. Just feed it into
It is an important
GPT.
part. It's an important part of becoming a scholar, you guys.
That's your mistake right there.
That's what they tell me, okay?
Your time, Kaitlyn, your time is money, and the amount of hours you're spending learning German, just in case you might need it to get one article, you could take that money and hire someone to translate it for you.
No.
Kaitlyn.
This is not how we should think about education, Skye. It's not fully just about what is the most productive or the most useful. It's also about being formed into a full scholar. It means you learn a lot of things.
Kaitlyn, the world does not need more scholars. The world needs more influencers.
No.
Influencers
That's
do
the
not
worst thing
need
you
to
could have said.
German.
Okay, how much of this is the fact that there's an older generation of scholars who had to learn German and they resent it?
And they're just mad.
And they want to make sure everyone coming up behind them has to go through the same hoops they did to justify their own existence.
Yeah, and why German? Why not Latin?
Don't
to
make
learn,
me comment on that.
Weren't we all supposed to learn Latin?
I am going to have to learn Latin, yeah.
Oh, okay. So you can identify bugs.
I know a good amount
correctly.
of Latin already, but
yeah. Oh, of course. Don't we all? I was just talking in Latin at the McDonald's drive-thru window just moments ago, as a matter of fact. Okay, speaking of the books that Kaitlyn is allowed to read or not, is one of them the Bible, Kaitlyn?
Of course.
Okay, because if you're in a grade school in Utah, a certain Utah school district right now, you can't check out the Bible. You cannot check out the Bible from certain grade school and middle school libraries in one Utah school district because a Utah parent, upset by book bans, gets the Bible pulled from school shelves. A Utah school district took the Bible off some bookshelves, officials said Friday, following a complaint from a parent upset by book bans who was hoping to expose the, quote, bad faith process. The parent, in a copy of the complaint obtained by NBC News, this is hard-hitting journalism.
Was the parent Lucian Greaves?
No, oh. I don't know. It doesn't say. Their name was redacted. They said their effort to boot the Bible was in protest of a 2022 Utah law that made it easier to remove, quote, pornographic or indecent content from schools. And in their complaint, the parent wrote, I thank the Utah legislature and Utah Parents United for making this bad faith process so much easier and way more efficient. Now we can all ban books and you don't even need to read them or be accurate about it. Heck, you don't even need to see the book. This was, and then they posted an 8-page typed list of examples of objectionable material from the Bible, quoting the exact verses, and put that in the complaint. So a district review committee decided to retain the book in school library circulation only at the high school level, where you can handle that level of violence and vulgarity is how they defined it.
So it's a what's good for the goose is good for the gander situation.
Yes, the Bible, this is our conclusion, is too vulgar and violent for elementary age kids or middle school age kids.
Okay.
By the standard set by the new legislation in the state of Utah.
So isn't this a whole lesson in be careful what you ask for? It's like it's sort of like the back in the 90s, was it? There were these after school prayer groups and Bible studies and everyone was fighting and they got it. And then under that same legal precedent, they also started
Greaves.
You get the satanic clubs then you get the LGBT clubs, and then the conservative Christian parents freak out going, no, that's not what we meant.
That's not what we meant. The moral is, if you're going to legalize a new way to hit people with a stick, don't be stunned when you get hit with a stick that you just legalized.
There you go.
Yeah. Kaitlyn, you're a scholar.
I'm working on it.
What do you make of? Because you can't just say kindergartners should have access to everything that has ever been published.
Right.
You can't say that.
Right.
So what are they doing wrong? Here's my question for Kaitlyn Shess, the Kaitlyn Shess. What are they doing wrong? And is it really an argument about what is objectionable content? What is pornographic? What is obscene?
Yeah. I do think that some Christians would do better to acknowledge the fact that there are parts of the Bible that really we can't well communicate to really young children. I remember going through a curriculum when I worked in children's ministry that wanted to have every single part of the Bible in the children's curriculum at every age.
Must have been one of mine.
When it was not.
Was it the Cringe and Cry Bible?
No, but when we got to Hosea, it was no, there's not a way to tell this story that is both truthful and appropriate for their age. It's just not possible.
Yeah.
So I just think that this is an interesting story to kind of press Christians on that. But I do think your question about our standards for this are really important, because what we tend to do is just come up with a list. This is the plugged in movie version, right? That my parents would look up a movie on Plugged In. And it would be here's a list of every bad thing in the movie. And sometimes there was analysis, to be fair, but usually the attitude of the person looking it up was give me the list of the bad words and the bad things that happen. And I think that that's not only an approach to storytelling that's unfortunate, but this is a good example of it's not just about what boxes get checked of bad things. It's about what kind of moral formation is happening and what kind of exposure is appropriate for children. And I don't think that we really have to be worried too much about, children reading the whole Bible in one sitting. I don't think libraries need to make sure that they don't read too much of the Bible. I don't think that's a real concern. But I do think it would be better to evaluate not just the Bible, which is kind of, the gotcha point of this thing, but all sorts of other examples of literature that we might think, okay, it checks some lists of bad things happen, but how are those bad things portrayed? And how are the characters morally formed? And how is the reader morally formed? Jessica Hooten-Wilson, who wrote a whole book on reading for spiritual formation, talks a lot about this. You can't just say, oh, this bad thing happens. It's how is it portrayed? How is the person formed in their reading? And I have found that often, when I interact with Christians who I think have a really bad read of some kind of culture, if it's a movie or a book or something, it worries me, because I think that probably says something about how we're reading the Bible too. We think that everything is prescriptive in exactly the same way, when we should be reading a lot of the acts of violence, especially violence against women across Scripture, and saying that's not prescriptive. We shouldn't just be taking that as if it is. But I know adult Christians who have done that. So part of the issue is not just what kinds of books do children have access to, but what kind of readers have they been formed to be?
What do you think of the trend in young adult fiction and other books that they're putting trigger warnings now on the back of the covers because of the content?
It's plugged in reviews for the left.
Yeah, but do we need to do that for the Bible? Could you imagine how long that list of triggers would be, given the content?
That would be very long. Cruelty to animals.
This is a whole other. I'm really going to restrain myself here, Skye. But everything you're saying is another good example of just the you alone with a Bible model that we have been taught is not the way you're supposed to read Scripture. If it's just you alone, there's a lot you won't not be able to handle, that won't be appropriate for you, that you won't understand, that might not be spiritually formative in the right way at that moment. That's why we're given the gift of the church and the Holy Spirit to help us.
But Kaitlyn, the Bible is clear. Even a child can understand it. The Bible is clear, and even a child can understand it. Which is why my granddaughter just came at me with a tent peg. I'm a little concerned about that. I need to double check the kids' Bible I got her.
Well, you need to explain to her that that's not prescriptive, Phil.
It's not prescriptive.
Descriptive.
Descriptive. Mm-hmm. Yes, that's all.
Child completely understands those concepts.
That's all.
Right.
There should be a Bible that's color-coded. All we got the red parts. That's what Jesus said. Now, the yellow parts are descriptive. The blue parts are prescriptive. And then we can all argue about whether they got it right or not.
And the yellow parts are communist.
The red parts are Oh, yeah. Are they red or yellow? That's so confusing. Man. Kaitlyn, you okay?
Yeah,
I feel like we just lost you.
I'm horrified by that.
I feel like... Okay. Two things are in the news in the last week. While I was on vacation, I was in Florida with my grandkids. I almost said my grandkids and great-grandkids. Good Lord, I'm not that old yet. My kids and grandkids. My daughter wanted to take her kids to Disney World. She just felt that it was time. And because I took her to Disney World, then it's like, Dad, take us to Disney World. Like, oh man, this is June. This is going to be a nightmare. Anyway, I'm back. But while I was there, a couple of things were all over Twitter. One was the new Duggar family documentary on Amazon Prime, Happy Shiny People, about those crazy Duggars. And what was the show called? 17 and counting, and then 18 and counting, and then it was 19 and counting, and then it was, you actually guys are kind of nasty and we can't talk about you anymore. We have to cancel you.
I don't think I ever saw a single episode of that show. I
saw clips.
Yeah.
I watched a lot of it.
Really?
Were you forced to?
Oh, yeah.
Wait.
No, I mean, I wasn't forced. I was a kid, though. I was like a teenager. My mom watched it.
Okay.
What was the draw?
Wait, hang on.
Okay,
hang on.
Sorry.
The other thing that happened last week that I wanted to mention was the death of Pat Robertson. So these are two things, and I am going to find the connection between them.
He was 93 and counting.
So... So help me God, I'm going to find the connection between them. Okay, Kaitlyn, you actually watched the documentary.
The documentary.
The Shiny Happy People documentary. And did you find it entertaining?
I mean, I think they want you to find it entertaining.
Okay. Was it more disturbing? Because I've heard some people say it's just it's so disturbing, and or that they had kind of bad flashbacks to their own childhoods in very highly controlling religious environments.
I did not grow up in that kind of context. I mean, some of the things were familiar in the sense that some of these ideas were like just in the water of evangelicalism. Like there's a good amount of attention paid to the umbrella model. There's Jesus, there's the husband, there's the wife,
Jesus,
there's the children.
Father, mother, children, pets. Yes. That's how it works. The chipmunk.
The pets are important.
The gerbils.
Do the children have authority over the pets?
The gerbils have tiny little umbrellas, and the children can just spank them. Spank that gerbil, kids. Gosh. Spank that gerbil. Okay.
That's awful. So I did, some of those things were familiar to me, but in general, nothing about that was my church experience. It was a lot of stuff I was familiar with. I met a lot of people in seminary who went to the Institute for Basic Life Principles and did the ATI Gothard homeschooling curriculum and all of that stuff. So I had heard a lot about it, but I thought it was really well done. And they brought in some experts. Kristen Kobes-Dumais was on there.
Yeah.
Alex Harris, who's a really incredible, he works with the AND campaign as a lawyer. Joshua Pease, who does a lot of this kind of research into Christianity and politics. And especially he's done research into the kind of Gothard world. I thought it was really thoughtful and well done. And I actually thought there were times when it could have gotten more explicitly just anti-Christian in general, and it did not.
Okay.
There are moments I think anytime someone who is not in the Christian world hears Christians talking about we want to take back the world for Jesus, you can find a way to put that in a documentary that's like, they want to take over the world. And you're like, okay, I don't know. But I thought it was, and there were a lot of people interviewed who had grown up in that context that you could tell had really changed what they believed, but part of what was really helpful for them were other people getting out of it.
I'd heard only Jill Duggar was the only Duggar kid that participated in the documentary. Did they explain why no other Duggars wanted to take part?
They didn't talk about that, but Jill, who was on it, talked a lot about how, even though she agreed to be on it, it was really painful. I think a lot of people do forget that this is a family, and every awful thing that happens in this family is them dealing with their family. And there was other extended family that was in it, not the immediate family. So Jim Bob's sister and his niece were in it, but I can imagine why the immediate family wouldn't want to be very involved. And I thought the documentary did a good job of it's a little bit about the Duggars. It's really about the larger Gothard ecosystem. And even after Gothard is out, because he was sexually harassing young girls, even once he's out, the focus is really on the organization as a whole and some of the harmful teachings that people can find parallels to other not just Christian, other really high control environments.
Right. So, okay, Bill Gothard. That's who the show is really about. It's not really about the Duggars. It's about Bill Gothard. Who's Bill Gothard? He founded the Institute in Basic Life Principles in the late 60s, I think. And during the late 70s, he was filling auditoriums with up to 10,000 people for week-long seminars to learn how to do life according to his basic life principles. So he found the basic principles for life. That's, boy, talk about build a better mousetrap. If you can say, I have found the principles that make life work, the world will beat a path to your door. And they did for like 30 years. They beat a path to his door, and his organization got huge, and he was huge in homeschooling, and they did seminars all over the place. He encouraged Bible memorization, large families, homeschooling, avoiding debt, male superiority and female obedience, and of course, modest dress codes. But even for men should not have beards. No beards. Beards are not biblical. There are no beards in the Bible.
You're kidding.
No beards in the Bible, Skye.
Well, no. Okay, seriously though, what basis did he give for no beards?
I don't know.
I think it was really like a beards are hippie thing.
Grooming. Yeah, grooming. So,
wow.
Okay, so that's so I have a run-in with Bill Gothard, which I don't know if you know about, but not actually Bill, but Bill's brother Steve. Steve Gothard was also in the ministry and had to leave the ministry because he was having affairs with secretaries in the ministry.
But did he have a beard?
No, he didn't have a beard.
No.
But it's also bad to have affairs. Beards and affairs were both frowned on at the...
Pick your battles, man.
Institute. Shouldn't it be Institute 4? What's Institute in?
I keep saying Institute 4 because that makes more sense.
What is an Institute in? That is weird. Anyway, so Steve had to go away. Steve had 2 dogs, Maltese, little white Maltese dogs named Charlie and Reggie. Steve had to go away.
Those are actually their names?
Charlie and Reggie, Steve's little Maltese dogs. Do you know where Steve's little white Maltese dogs went when Steve had to go away? They came to live with me. Yes, we got Steve's dogs.
How did that happen?
When I was in high school, 2 little white Maltese dogs showed up at our house, and someone said, yeah, these are from Steve Gothard. He can't have them anymore.
Is there like some ministry for adopting the dogs of disgraced ministers?
I don't know. I asked my mother to explain to me at one point, not too long ago, how did we end up with Steve Gothard's dogs? And she explained it, and it kind of made sense, but I don't remember what it was. It was like a friend of a friend said, I got these 2 dogs, and he can't. And do you want to? And they came, and they were scented with a Ralph Lauren polo. So how
do you know?
Yeah.
I was told. My mother knows all.
Purposefully scented.
Yes. He
did they come with the bottle?
No, he sprayed his dogs with Ralph Lauren polo, and it took a while for it to wear off. So these little...
I'm sure the dogs love that.
Manly scented white Maltese running around our house. Anyway, Reggie was not very smart. Reggie, a couple years later, we let outside to go potty, and he wandered off in the snow and never came back. Just wandered off. Well, I don't know if he was looking for Steve.
Steve Gothard seemed like he was a tough dog to keep on the porch too, if you know what I mean.
Oh, that's quick. That's good. And then Reggie, we had Reggie for a couple more years after that. It was our last connection to the Gothard empire. And then my stepdad accidentally backed over Reggie with his truck. That was the end of Reggie. Reggie was gone.
That is the wildest
story
I've ever heard.
Don't let Phil take your dog for the weekend.
No, it doesn't go well. Anyway, I had Steve Gothard's dogs. So that's Bill Gothard. So Steve had to leave. And then Bill in 2014 had to step down after he was accused of sexual harassment and molestation by 34 women.
34?
34.
That's
women.
like, those are Cosby
women who
numbers.
were girls.
Some of them were minors at the time.
Yeah.
Yes. They are.
Wow.
But not like, no one accused him of rape. No one accused him of violence.
Someone did.
Oh, really? Someone did?
Yes.
Oh.
Wait a minute.
Because the investigation found no illegal, no criminal activity.
Okay. They dropped the case, the joint case against him. He countersued. And lost his countersuit. So there was enough credibility to these claims that they couldn't sustain the countersuit.
So it was harassment.
Harassment.
What was he?
Harassment and molestation, some unwanted touching. I don't know.
Isn't molestation a criminal offense? Especially an underage girl?
I think when this actually all went to court, the statute of limitations had passed.
Oh, geez.
I don't know. Anywho,
it's not
here's
good.
The thing I don't get about here's the thing I don't get about Bill Gothard. Okay? Well, there's a lot. Okay, there's a lot. But he was in Hinsdale, Illinois. He wasn't like Skye went away. Skye just went away. Skye's gone. Rapture alert. Kaitlyn and I have been left behind.
Yeah.
We'll just keep talking, and hopefully Skye will come back. Hopefully Skye will come back. I don't know where he went. Anywho, here's what I don't understand about Bill Gothard. Kaitlyn, are you with me?
Mm-hmm.
He never married.
Yeah.
He never had kids.
Correct.
He never had a family.
Yeah.
His whole life was putting on classes to teach couples how to parent and do marriage.
Yep.
And he never parented or did marriage. It wasn't that a red flag? Why isn't that a red flag to people? You don't know? And his brother was hitting on all the secretaries. So it was just I don't really get that. Okay. Then I want to talk. So that's Bill Gothard, and that's the Institute in, not of, Basic Life Principles. Pat Robertson died last week. He was born in 1930. That's a long time ago.
Whoa.
He saw a lot. He saw the Depression. He saw World War II, not one, two. So he was also very busy. He founded the Christian Broadcast Network, Regent University, Operation Blessing, the ministry, International Family Entertainment, which became better known as the Family Channel, the cable network, which he sold to Fox News Corp in 1997 for $2 billion. He founded the American Center for Law and Justice, the ACLJ. He founded the Christian Coalition, which was kind of the successor to the Moral Majority. He ran for president. He hosted a TV show from 1966 to 2021. He was also interesting because he was a Southern Baptist pastor, and he was also a charismatic, not a typical combination. He was also interesting because he was concerned about climate change. He called for the legalization of marijuana, although he later changed his mind. He also did things like suggesting that Hurricane Katrina was God's punishment for abortion. And he supported some claims about a worldwide Jewish conspiracy. So he was kind of what was he? Skye?
Mixed nuts. It's kind of yeah. But he definitely lived a very colorful life.
Very colorful life. So he was instrumental, not absolutely central to the rise of the religious right, not as much as Jerry Falwell or a few other people, but he was like the next tier. He was
I think I don't know if I would agree with that.
Okay.
Because I think his broadcasting was so critical to the spread of the religious right. Yeah, he may not have been the intellectual kind of headwaters of it all, the way that Falwell was, but I think his infrastructure proliferated it in a way that Falwell could not have done without.
Yeah. Although
Robertson.
I don't think he spread it as much as Dobson did, because Dobson was on the radio, had a much bigger audience than Robertson on.
Yeah, Robertson never ran for president though. He gave a lot. Dobson, never ran for president, and Robertson did, and gave a lot of exposure that way.
Dobson,
I don't know.
Yes, that's true.
Dobson, it's not a world I've ever really moved in a significant way, so I can't speak about it.
What world is it? What world is it? What world are we talking about?
I think we're talking about Christian broadcasting / religious right world.
Okay.
Is that a fair way to define it?
Okay, so what's kind of interesting about Robertson is he kind of became more and more of a joke, the older he got, and as he said more ridiculous things. So I am curious, like who lionizes him? after his death? Who says this was a great man and he did, who praises his accomplishments? Or did he become too much of a comic book character?
Well,
but
he
the other thing
outlived most of the people that probably would have lionized him. That's the problem with living that long, is everyone who respected you is already gone.
It'd be like Falwell Jr. would say, "Oh, my father was so inspired by," I don't know. But I haven't seen a whole lot of that happening. But here's my question. As a charismatic and a Southern Baptist, what place did he hold between those two worlds? Because, today you've got the Lance Wallnows and the Dutch Sheets and the guys that are very charismatic, and they're all MAGA. So you've got the charismatic MAGA, and then you've got the Robert Jeffersons, who are the Southern Baptist MAGA. And he kind of had a foot in both of those worlds, which was a little bit unique. Kind of like Eric Metaxas.
But isn't the common thread the MAGA thing? Like, isn't that what binds it all together? And as long as you have that, you're accepted?
But there is more, I guess so. There's a heavy, on the charismatic side, there's more of a heavy spiritualization of world events than there is just if you're a straight Southern Baptist. And he did that. He, like this, Haiti, the disaster in Haiti is because they made a deal with the devil.
Right.
And you don't hear as much of that from the Jeffersons or even the Falwells that are more just
Falwell said that 9/11 was caused by the ACLU and the gays and the lesbians and the abortionists and all that.
And do you know whose show he was on when he said that? Pat Robertson's.
There you go.
I do think, Phil, there's a difference between, I think the place where the Venn diagram of those two groups overlaps, a significant portion of that overlap is, even if the non-charismatic folks are uncomfortable with some of the displays of spirituality that will happen among the more charismatic Trumpy evangelicals, the desire to kind of interpret all world events through a certain understanding of future biblical prophecies is something that most of them can get on board with, especially the dispensationalist folks, which I think sometimes people forget that should feel like real conflict, the charismatic folks and the dispensationalist folks, because the dispensationalist folks are largely, if not entirely, cessationists. That's a pretty important part of these different eras. So why would you get along so well with the...
To get some of the...
Glossary time.
Yeah,
jargon.
Thank you.
Yeah. So cessationists believe that the miraculous gifts of the Spirit are no longer active in the world. Obviously, charismatics believe those gifts are very active in the world.
In fact, here comes one now.
Yes. And that's... So you would think... no overlap there, right? This thing that's so important to the more charismatic folks, the gifts continue, is not necessarily the same amount of importance to all people in the non-charismatic world. But for many of them, that can be a really definitive thing. I remember growing up in dispensationalist churches where we were really concerned about the charismatic church down the road that had people speaking in tongues. That was a clear sign of they are not our people. That is not a church you want to be in. So you'd think there would be big fights, and there is, but I do think the real overlap is wanting to interpret with a kind of disturbing to me degree of certainty how world events fit into biblical prophecy, and maybe not even always explicit biblical prophecy. Sometimes, yes, it's Revelation is this timeline, and here's the timeline where the place we are in the timeline. Sometimes it is, I think that I can kind of take on the mantle of the prophet and say this world event has this kind of significance, which is something that Christians have been writing against doing that for the entire history of the church, because we are not only fallen creatures that can be wrong, but also because we don't have the perspective on the whole stretch of history that many of these people making those kinds of proclamations think they can have. But it feeds this desire for people to be certain. They want to know that scary things in the world out there don't just happen for no reason. And actually, this guy over here who I watch on TV or I listen to on the radio, he'll explain it for me. He'll tell me why it happens. And if I'm a good person, this is where there's also a weird prosperity gospel overlap. If I'm a good person, bad events don't happen to me, because bad events only happen to people who are immoral, and I'm going to be moral.
Okay, so here's where I want to go with this ultimately. Because I've been, I spent all last week in Disney World planning this show. I was really...
Oh, Phil, thank you.
I know. It's because it means that much to me. What is the appeal of a Robertson and a Gothard? And is there commonality in the appeal? And what about them made them so successful specifically in the 1970s?
I I'll take a run at that. And I think it's building off of what Kaitlyn just shared about the link between charismatics and dispensational cessationists. It's certainty.
Yeah.
Life is messy. The world is messy. Politics is messy. A pluralistic society is messy. Marriage is messy. Parenting is messy. These are really complicated things. And here come Robertson and Gothard saying, here's the formula. Here's how to do it and get a guaranteed outcome. Here's how to make sure your family and your kids and your country are all blessed. We have figured it out. The principles for life. And they're communicating that in mass media, whether radio or television or publishing, and it's just people gobble it up. And maybe it was so hot in the 70s and into the 80s because you were coming out of an era in the 1960s where the uncertainty was kind of cranked up to 11. And people were looking for that assurance, and they were ready to provide it, and people bought it by the bucket loads.
Yeah, I do think it's interesting that just as Nixon was promising law and order, this is the 60s were chaos. There's all these race riots, and women are throwing off of their aprons and going going to work in offices like men, was that there was a desire to reorder the world. Like we need to bring order back. And Gothard in particular was saying, this is how things are supposed to be ordered. It goes from the top down. It's a hierarchy. This is authority. We're going to, so I almost think Nixon and Gothard were preaching the same gospel of society is falling apart because order has broken down.
Well, when you read Jonathan Haidt and his understanding of the righteous mind in that book, he talks about there are certain personality types that are drawn towards conservative everything, including politics, and they find great comfort in clear categories where there's little ambiguity and there is a structure that is discernible and permanent. And that personality type is going to be very drawn to a Gothard kind of understanding of here's how the family and society and all the structures work, and it's all those nested umbrellas, and there you go. And it makes sense. And that's why you're seeing it again right now, where there's so much breakdown in established norms, from gender to marriage to even the preeminence of white Christian power in this country. All those things are breaking down, and it's freaking some people out, and they're hungry for that certainty again, and they're latching on to philosophies like Christian nationalism, among others, that says, here's the way it's supposed to be. Don't question it. We need to go back to this or we're going to lose everything. And Gothard was doing that 40, 50 years ago.
Okay. Kaitlyn, your turn.
Well, even in the documentary, they talk about, some of these, mostly people who were kids in the, variety of programs they had. They talk about their parents, and many of them will point out that their mom, especially, because it was often women who needed to kind of enforce the family being part of it, but often were still subjugated to a lot of the abuses of it. It was often women, at least described in the documentary, and I know people who will say this about their own families. It was women who came from abusive backgrounds. And if you're afraid that you don't know when the hammer's coming down, the idea that it's all very clear, there's a real emphasis in the Gothard world on kind of quietness and gentleness, even though there's quite authority behind it. And there's it could come down on you at any moment, but it's clear. These are the rules. I know when the father of the house is going to get angry because the rules have been laid out. I don't have to worry. I don't have to look at their face and figure it out. And so it was appealing to people who had been abused. And a friend and I were talking recently about how I think a lot of people who came out of maybe not abusive, sometimes just really high control in other ways, or not even quite to the level of high control, but just legalistic church backgrounds, who feel hurt by the church, it would be helpful for us to examine this dynamic and say, where could I, if I'm one of those people, seek a kind of really clear certainty in something? It might not be another church. It might not be another organization. It might be an online group. It might be a self-help guru. It might be, but I will still look for certainty that says, I know I'm the righteous one, and I know these people are wrong, and I'm in the clear, and nothing bad will happen to me. And I just think that that's a cycle, and it could be helpful for many people to examine for ourselves. Like, if I'm coming out of a really difficult church place, where am I looking for certainty anew? Because it's not going to just automatically be in a good place. There is good certainty. I think ultimately, eschatologically, in Scripture, we can have real certainty. But we're tempted all kinds of ways, not just in abusive churches, but by kind of online groups, by celebrities, while I was watching the Duggar documentary, I was also watching another documentary about a cult group that had no ties to Christianity, nothing really religious, but functioned very similarly. And it often brought in people who were looking for that kind of control and stability and certainty.
Okay, so if we've established that you can be very successful by promising order and meaning in a disordered world, how do I know when I'm doing that? When am I in danger of doing the same thing? And how do you, what's the alternative? What's the alternative? What's the opposite of Gotharding and Robertsoning?
I actually have a whole chapter in my book about exactly this.
Oh, ding.
Ding. Yeah. For those who've read like a lot of it talks about these different postures of how we relate to God. And all these different postures are really means of trying to gain control and mitigate our fears. And especially what you see in Robertson and Gothard is what I call life over God. It's principles. It's just I'm doing everything by the book. I'm following the right principles, therefore I will get the right outcomes. And there's lots of examples in there of how that manifests itself. Some extreme like you see here with Gothard, others much more subtle, but very common in American evangelicalism. And the answer to that is not trying to control God. You can't. If history and scriptures taught us anything, it's that God is notoriously uncooperative at our attempts at controlling him. So rather than trying to control him, even through righteous obedience and following biblical commands and on, we need to cultivate a life with God, of communion with him, where we are drawn so closely to him that we experience his goodness and his character, and we learn to trust him regardless of what may be happening around me, regardless of circumstances. They may not go the way I want, but I still trust you. This is what Jesus did on the cross. When, and Stephen does this when he's being stoned. I commit my spirit to you, or into your hands I commit my spirit. It's everything the world is doing to me is evil and awful right now, but I still trust your goodness because I know you. That's what the Christian life is. It's not controlling the world and God to get the outcomes I want, but trusting in the goodness of God, even in the darkest moment, because you know who he is. And in a lot of Christianity, we've just said, I don't want to do that work of actually living in communion with God. I just want to control the outcome. And here's somebody selling it to me. So any message or methodology that is predicated in control rather than communion is the problem.
Okay. Kaitlyn, do you agree, disagree?
I do agree. I also just think on a practical level, it would be helpful to examine some of the practices and habits you have for yourself and ask, does this make me safe but other people vulnerable? Like in the example of Gothard, there's rules about everything you have to do, but that whole structure of authority made many of these young women and girls vulnerable. I even thought about when I was in seminary, I remember a man in one of my classes, earnest guy who I really liked, talking about kind of the really strict rules that some Christian men will have about how they interact with women. And he said, it's keeping my marriage safe. And I said, well, there are some other people you are making vulnerable by doing that. You have put yourself into a place where you have treated women like threats, and that harms them. And so find ways to make your marriage secure that doesn't make other women vulnerable, that doesn't put them in a position that's harmful. And I think that's why so many of these mentalities put us in this place of it's me and my community, my immediate circle that I am trying to get security and stability for. And I don't really care what happens outside of that. And that's not a Christian orientation to the world and to creation. If we are to be, as it says at the very beginning of the people of God, when God is talking to Abraham, that you will be a blessing to the nations, and that orientation continues throughout all of Scripture, then that's the kind of way that we should be thinking about. We have ultimate stability and security in the return of Christ and the resurrection of our bodies and the promise that everything will one day be made new. And so from that eternal place of security, we can be open and outward, and we can seek security that is helpful for other people outside of the community that we have created, and that doesn't cost other people their security for ours. And that is the way of the world. And so if we're operating in those kinds of ways, we'll end up doing that to people.
So are there basic life principles? Are there not basic life principles, or are these just not them?
I think there are basic life principles, but you follow them not because the outcome is guaranteed. Okay. You follow them because they're good and right. Like a basic life principle is, don't commit murder.
It's a good one.
It's a good one.
What about yoga pants? Don't commit yoga pants.
Yeah, don't commit yoga pants. No, it's we just all the time we do this. When there's uncertainty, we want certainty. We're afraid, so we go for control. And it's not. I get the instinct to do that, but it just doesn't work that way. I mean, 2 examples: Job and Jesus. Job is identified as a righteous man who obeyed God. Jesus obviously was without sin. And from an outside point of view, you just look at the circumstances of their lives, and they're horrible. So you go, well, wait a minute. If it's all about trying to control outcomes, then it didn't work for Job and it didn't work for Jesus. Maybe I'm interpreting.
Jesus had a horrible life so that I don't have to.
Yeah, that's exactly what's popularly taught. But what you read in the New Testament is that we are to follow in his steps, to take up our cross and follow him. And
but are we?
Yes.
Are we doing it, or should we? So anyway, it's that I'm not against principles. I'm against attaching those principles to the promised outcome that you want.
Okay.
Right? I'm trying to teach my kids, hey, I won't give too many examples, but like, here's things that are good to do. And it doesn't mean it's all going to work out perfectly in the end, but it's still good to do them. Right? Yeah. Like we talked, just forget biblical stuff or faith stuff. We talked about all the research that shows when you do things in a certain order, like finish your education, get married, have children, if you do it in that order, it tends to work out better. It doesn't guarantee it's going to work out better. We can all give examples of people who did things in that order, and life got really hard and very messy. So it's not a guarantee. There's just lessons and wisdom to be employed, but it's different than controlling outcomes.
All right. Kaitlyn, any last advice for people that were hoping Bill Gothard was the answer to all of life's problems?
I'll just say that I think the other compelling part about this for a lot of people is that it means they won't make any mistakes and they won't have any regrets. And I think the scary thing about telling people that actually following Jesus in all of the various capacities that you do it, at your work, in your family, in your community, is messy, that you're always asking, what is God requiring of me now, and trying to answer it imperfectly. That's so scary because it means you will sometimes be wrong and you will sometimes make mistakes. And I think what's missing from so much of this is not just grace because it's so legalistic, but grace to say, if we're being honest about our condition as fallen, finite humans in this world, we are, even with the best of intentions, even with the best resources available, even under the best conditions, we will make mistakes in judgment on how to handle these things. Our principles will be wrong. Our decisions will be wrong. And there's grace for that. And that's why that ultimate security in the making of all things new at the end of all time is something that we can take ultimate comfort in. That is redemption of even the mistakes that we make, even from our best intentions.
Ooh, that's good. Okay. And Kaitlyn's next book, after the one that's about to come out, will be Kaitlyn Chess's Basic Principles for Life.
Absolutely not.
It's going to be great. It is going to be...
It'll all be about marriage and parenting.
All the stages of life that you have not yet hit. It's like how to handle your retirement by Kaitlyn Chess.
I'm married and have kids, and I promised my wife many decades ago that I would never build a ministry or write a book about marriage advice or parenting.
Yeah. Wise. That's wise.
But you're thinking about changing your mind. You're this close. You're this close to that parenting book, Skye.
No, I'm not.
What if Jesus was serious about children? Is that the next one?
That could be a good book in a very different way.
Right, yeah. What if Jesus was serious about parenting?
Parenting, yeah.
No, I don't think he was.
He had so much parenting advice. Yeah. So much parenting advice. I think it would be,
if you love your mother or father more than me, you're unworthy of me. Good night, everybody.
No. Okay, see you later. Okay, thanks for coming along. Thanks, all you supporters. Go check out Holy Post Plus and all the great stuff you can get at holypost.com. And stay around for the interview because it's amazing. I'm sure. Right, Skye? Right, Kaitlyn? Who did this one? I don't know who did this one.
We'll find out, but the content is great.
It's fantastic. You're going to love it. Have a great week. We will see you next time. Bye, guys. This episode of The Holy Post is sponsored by Hiya Health. Hey, do you have kids? Do you care about their health? Of course you do. Most kids' vitamins are basically candy in disguise, filled with 2 teaspoons of sugar, unhealthy chemicals, and other gummy junk kids really shouldn't be eating. That's why Hiya was created, the pediatrician-approved, super-powered, chewable vitamin for kids. 0 sugar, 0 gummy junk, yet they taste great and are perfect for picky eaters. Hiya fills in the most common gaps in modern children's diets to provide the full-body nourishment our kids need with a yummy taste they love. And we've worked out a special deal with Hiya for their best-selling children's vitamin. Receive 50% off your first order. To claim this deal, you need to go to hiyahealth.com/holypost. This deal is not available on their regular website. Go to hiyahealth.com/holypost and get your kids the full-body nourishment they need to grow into healthy adults. And thanks to Hiya Health for sponsoring this episode. This episode of The Holy Post is sponsored by Faithful Counseling. Sometimes life feels like I'm lugging around a 1,000-pound backpack full of yuck. Sure, I can unload all my struggles on my friends or my spouse or my dog, but often it's more productive to sit down with a trained therapist. Therapy is expensive, though, and finding a therapist who shares your faith convictions is hard. That's where Faithful Counseling can help. With more than 3,000 licensed therapists across all 50 states, Faithful Counseling will pair you with someone who can help. More affordable than traditional counseling and more flexible, too. You can request a different therapist at any time. What have you got to lose except that big weight on your shoulders? We all need to talk to someone sometime, and Faithful Counseling can help. So keep growing into the best version of you. Visit faithfulcounseling.com/holypost and get the professional, faith-based counseling that you need. They've even got a special offer for our listeners. Right now, you can get 10% off your first month at faithfulcounseling.com/holypost. Thanks again to Faithful Counseling for sponsoring this episode.
The role of women in the church continues to be a very contentious issue in some parts of the American church. For example, the Southern Baptists are meeting right now with factions divided over how much liberty or conformity to demand on this issue. But there's one thing that people on all sides agree on: we should follow what the Bible says. That's why I'm so grateful for Nijay Gupta's new book, Tell Her Story: How Women Led, Taught, and Ministered in the Early Church. Gupta says that we've overlooked or deliberately ignored the obvious role of women in Jesus' ministry and in the New Testament church. Part of the reason is that we take our culture's definitions of gender roles and we project them back onto the world of the New Testament. Instead, Gupta says we need to understand that women in the Roman Empire actually had far more power and authority than we think, and we need to read the New Testament with that context in mind. My conversation with Nijay isn't limited to the Bible and theology, however. It turns out that we have a lot in common, so I asked him about his own journey from being a son of Indian immigrants in Ohio to becoming a Christian and ultimately a New Testament scholar. I think you'll be encouraged by that part of our conversation as well. Nijay Gupta is a professor of New Testament at Northern Seminary, and he did his doctoral studies at the University of Durham under N.T. Wright. He's written a number of books and commentaries, and he's a senior translator for the New Living Translation. Here's my conversation with Nijay Gupta. Nijay Gupta, welcome to the Holy Post.
Thank you. Nice to finally meet you. We have so many mutual friends.
I know. Okay, so before we started recording, we talked about we both went to Miami University in Ohio. We overlapped by a year. Apparently, your older brother and I were there at the same time. We are both involved in the same campus ministry. Mm-hmm. You're a Gupta, for goodness sake. You're Indian by background. Right. I'm half Indian. So let me get
And I work in Chicago.
Yes, you're at Northern Seminary in Chicago. So tons of connections here. Before we get into your book, which I'm looking forward to talking about, I just want to hear a little bit more about your story and background because I don't know too many Guptas that are Christians. Right. So how did you end up as a seminary professor?
So I grew up in North Central Ohio, Ashland, Ohio. If you're ever there, there's Grandpa's Cheese Barn as our famous landmark. And my parents came from India in the early 70s. They came from northern India, Punjab. And I was born late 70s. And my parents, Hindu. I grew up nominally Hindu. My parents are kind of on and off devout. My mom more than my dad. And it was really my brother who became a Christian in college. The middle brother, my older brother. I'm the youngest, and he would come home on the weekends, start taking me to church. And I was a 16-year-old brown kid in a white rural town. And I just needed to find my place in the world. This is the Michael W. Smith era, my place in the world. And Jesus just found me there in this little town, and with a hitching post at the Walmart for the Amish. And I think I didn't fit in my family very well. Like, you might know this, Skye, but a good Indian is good at math and science, which I was not. And if you're going to play sports, it's probably going to be tennis. I was seated last on the tennis team. I was terrible at tennis. And, your aspirations are to be a scientist or something like that. And consolation prize, I did become a doctor, maybe not the right kind of doctor, but my brother became a math teacher. My oldest brother became a surgeon. And I was in many ways the black sheep of the family. And Jesus just found me and welcomed me warmly into his family as is. I don't blame my parents for everything. They're wonderful people. But I found my place amongst the Jesus people. And I went to college, as you mentioned, at Miami University. My parents thought I was kind of in a cult because I was going to church like 5 times a week. Youth group and choir and all this. I was in puppets ministry. This was the roaring 90s.
Oh, my gosh. We have so many things. We should be in a support group together.
That's right. This is where they would rip off like pop songs and make them Christian and all that. So my parents, I wanted to go to Moody Bible Institute. I don't know why, but it was like the only Christian institution I knew of back then. And my parents thought this was crazy and I was in a cult. So they said, if we're going to help pay for college, you have to go to, a secular college. And my brother was at Miami University of Ohio. I went there as well. I was involved in campus ministry. And one day on a Sunday, Walt Kaiser, who was a seminary professor, was visiting from Massachusetts. And he actually preached or spoke at my church. I actually was not at church, but my roommate was. And so he brought home a catalog. And I started looking at this catalog, seminary catalog for Gordon Conwell. I just thought, this is amazing. Like classes on C.S. Lewis and Tolkien and Bible and exegesis. And now in Crusade, the hero of Crusade, other than Bill Bright, was Robert Coleman, Master Plan of Evangelism.
Yeah, he was my professor at Trinity.
Okay, he was my professor, Gordon Conwell.
Yeah.
So he had just shifted over to Gordon Conwell. I knew that Mounce was there, who had created the Greek textbook. I knew that Walt Kaiser was there, this legendary Old Testament theologian. Doug Stewart, who had co-written Bible for All It's Worth, How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. So I really wanted to go to Gordon Conwell. So I ended up going to seminary, not vocationally as much, but more just because I love studying the Bible. And I had been interested in campus ministry. I was involved in Crusade, but I was also involved in Navigators. So I just been open to different options. And I just fell in love with the seminary context. I'm an introvert, believe it or not. And so I just love spending all day by myself, reading and researching and emailing and being on social media a bit. I just found my ministry, reading, studying, teaching, writing, learning. So in seminary, I really caught the teaching bug. I got to TA for Greek. I ended up going to the University of Durham for a couple reasons. One is Harry Potter filming site, first 2 movies. But more importantly, N.T. Wright was the Bishop of Durham. I got a chance to TA for him, which was really fun. Got to work with John Barclay, Stephen Barton, legendary New Testament scholars. It was just Jimmy Dunn was still around. It was just a great experience all around. So yeah, that's kind of in my journey in brief.
Okay, not to get too personal, but I'm just very curious. A couple things. First, what did you study at Miami?
I did what was called the ministry major, which was find the easiest major so you could spend the least amount of time on it so you could focus on ministry. So I did speech communications, and with an emphasis in public relations, which gave me a little bit of a business angle to make my parents happy that I could be employable. Because I saw a poster one time on a professor's door, and it's like all the jobs you can do with speech comm. Yeah. And actually one of them was DJ. I just thought that was funny. Like, you can do all this stuff. You can be a DJ. okay.
Yeah, there's lots of DJs that require a 4-year college degree.
Right. But I knew it was an easy major. I knew I could kind of skate through. I could get away with never going to the library, which was kind of one of my proudest moments is not going to the Miami Library.
Yeah, that's what I look for in a New Testament professor. Someone who tries to avoid the library.
That's right. I made up for all my sins in seminary, but in terms of not caring about school. But I really wanted to study Greek because I loved the Bible, and they didn't have biblical Greek, but they had classical Greek.
Right.
So I ended up taking a couple courses to fulfill my bachelor's, and I ended up basically getting a minor. I didn't declare it, but I basically got a minor in classical Greek. So I did something in college.
Okay, so that takes me to the next question, and there's a little projection going on here. When you were getting to the end of your college years, and you were deciding what to do next, and you're looking at Gordon Conwell and seminary and all that, and please tell me if this is too personal, how did your family react when you came home and said, "Hey, I'm going to go to seminary"? Because I know how mine reacted.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not going to say they kind of gave up on me, but they knew that I wasn't in college. They knew that I wasn't ambitious in the way that my brothers were, and I didn't really have a direction. My brothers were both like, just make a plan, stick to it, and get it done. And, became highly successful. And I am an efficient person, but I just really lacked direction in college. I lacked passion. I just didn't know. So I think I'm not going to say they gave up on me, but they were okay with a choose your adventure kid. So I kind of, I kind of floundered a bit. I did go straight to seminary, but that wasn't the original plan. I was going to do church planting with a church. And I actually ended up getting fired. Very few people know this story, but I was just terrible at it. And I got into some conflict with the pastor, and 2 months into it, I got canned. And so my parents actually approached me, and I had planned to go to seminary the next year. And this was like July, August. And they said, we think you should go now. And so my dad drove me 700 miles from Ashland to Gordon Conwell, dropped me off at Gordon Conwell, and said, good luck.
So there was some calculation there that maybe your parents felt like, well, 2 out of 3 ain't bad, right? That's okay.
Yeah. I think their biggest fear was that I'm not going to have enough money to live on, because they didn't think of pastoral ministry as a real, or campus ministry as a real lucrative situation. Little do they know that, there are pastors that make millions, but,
which is I think why we all got into it.
That's right. That's right. The notoriety. Mm-hmm. I think that was part of it. I think is that fear. At the same time, classic kind of Indian culture, they want their kids to just be good people, and they live in a town where there's a high Christian population, and they know Christians to be good people. And so I think there was a little bit of optimism or pride there. Like he lacks vocational direction, but he's got his head on straight, I think is what they would have said back then.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we could talk about this all day. When I made the decision to go to seminary, I had an older brother also, and he was doing anyway, it was like, it put my dad especially in a bind with the other Indian people in his community and what all their kids were doing. And they're all doctors and business people and entrepreneurs and lawyers and engineers. And the story came back to me of my dad being at a party one evening, and everyone was talking about their kids and what they're doing. And somebody asked my dad, so what's Skye doing? And my dad said, well, he's pursuing ministry.
Yeah.
And this Indian couple responded, oh, government work. That's fantastic.
Prime minister.
Right. Because, of course, in India, ministry is government.
Yeah.
And he did not correct them. He just let it stay. He's like, yeah, sure, government work, whatever. So, yeah, there's anyway. Like I said, we should be in a support group together talking through all these.
I remember it'd been several years. I couldn't find a job after I got my PhD. This was like the year 3, 4, 5. I bounced around different states doing temporary jobs. And I remember, my dad, I was making nothing. I remember my first full-time job, I made $40,000 in Seattle. Yeah. With 3 kids. Anyway, and I remember my dad, coming to visit me and pulling me aside and saying, you could still be a nurse.
Yeah,
thought,
you have other
not
options.
the right timing, Dad. Thanks.
I had this bizarre conversation
love.
with my dad probably in the last year. And I have two kids in college now, one in high school. It's just a different phase of life and everything. And my dad actually said to me, and we're close and we have a great relationship, but he said to me, I can't believe you actually did it. And I was like, did what? And he's like, when you made the decision to pursue ministry and this whole thing, he's like, I thought you were going to be financially dependent on me for the rest of your life. And,
sounds familiar.
Yeah. And he's like, you never asked me for any money. And he's like, you pulled it off. You did it. And it was actually a very satisfying moment for me to be like, well, it isn't that I did it. It's that God's been very faithful. And I'm incredibly grateful for that. But and I know his concern at the time, like your parents, no doubt, their concern was for your well-being and family and all. It's not like they have some, greedy ambitions or anything. It's just they want to make sure you're well taken care of. And immigrants especially have that concern for legitimate reasons. So anyway, I'm glad to see that you have obviously done well in your profession and publishing and teaching, and grateful for the work you're doing, which we should probably spend some time on this interview actually talking about. Let's get into the book. So your book is called Tell Her Story, How Women Led, Taught, and Ministered in the Early Church. Okay, I have a lot of notes here of stuff I want to talk to you about, and we're not going to have time to cover all. We're going to have to do some bonus stuff. But let's begin here. You give a good chunk of the first part of the book to talking about Deborah, the Old Testament judge. Right. And the book is about the New Testament. It's about the early church and women in the early church. Why did you decide to give so much attention to Deborah? Why is she such a critical character from the Jewish Bible, the Hebrew Bible, for understanding the New Testament? Right. Explain Deborah. Why do we need to get this character right?
Yeah, there's two reasons I start with Deborah. One is kind of strategic and one is theological. So the theological reason is people fixate on the New Testament, and it's just really important. I teach New Testament, but really I teach the whole Bible, and I just try to make sure we get to the New Testament when we need to get to the New Testament, because unfortunately there's been this bifurcation throughout history that the New Testament is, kind of the replacement for the Old Testament, or it supersedes the Old Testament. And that's just not the way that Paul or Jesus, the gospel writers, thought about it. So it's important that we treat the Bible as one thing rather than two different things. Sometimes I talk to my students about the problem of bad cop, good cop. The Old Testament is bad cop. The Lutheran hammer use of the law beats you up and tells you how sinful you are. That's not the way Jesus looked at it. That's not the way Paul looked at it. So one is really theological, to say we can't really talk about women in the New Testament unless we talk about women in the Old Testament. A second reason, strategic, is Christian culture, evangelical culture, is full of these stereotypes about women as gullible, weaker-willed, emotional, relational versus something else, versus logical. And when I was teaching in Seattle, I taught a course on Judges for kind of a public community course. Someone just handed me the course, said, teach this. I thought, that'll be easy. And I ended up learning so much from the book of Judges. And the reason I start with Deborah is because she defies all of the stereotypes that we have about where a woman should be, what they're like, and what they should be doing. So if you say a woman should really be at home, emotionally supporting their family, cooking meals, nurturing and all of that, and there's nothing wrong with that. Like, I nurture my children, I cook meals. There's nothing wrong with all that. But Deborah's out there in the public square, sitting on a seat of judgment, adjudicating cases according to Torah. She's a prophet. She goes into war. There's a military song sung about her, and she's considered the most virtuous of all the judges. And the judges are the singular leader of Israel that's meant to usher in the peace for the people. And so she just blows up all those stereotypes. I want to start there by just shifting the conversation. Because I feel like often this conversation is, Nijay, how liberal are you? How liberal are you going to just be driven away by culture? And I want to start off by saying Judges is thousands of years old, and it shows an independent woman sitting on Israel's highest seat.
So what do you say to the folks who would go, okay, yeah, obviously that story is there. You can't make it disappear, but it's sort of the exception that proves the rule. Yeah. Because you don't see, for example, a pattern in the Old Testament of women in those kinds of roles of leadership. Deborah does stand out as an exceptional example. So why not just say it's the exception that proves the rule?
Yeah. Well, the question is, what kind of leaders do we want? Do we want bad male leaders because we have a lot of those in the Old Testament? Or do you just want good leaders, right? If we're all sitting down planting a church, we're going to say we want good leaders. We're not going to say we're going to just do what's in the majority in the Bible. And unfortunately, the majority is bad kings. If you've seen a chart of the kings of Israel, there's like a little teeny tiny section of the good kings. Right.
And even the good ones are not
great. They're not great.
Problems. David, oh my goodness. Yeah.
Right. And, this is really, I'm going to use one of those $1 million seminary words. This is a hermeneutics issue of being able to see with spirit guided vision. This is often what Paul does. He says, when we read the Old Testament, we need to be on the lookout for this breadcrumb trail of a golden thread of faith, or where we see Jesus, or where we see, what some scholars call the great reversal, where God is going to overturn people's expectations. Here's a good question. If David was going to be the best, why start with Saul? Well, you start with Saul to say, this is not what we want, right?
Right.
And so, I think this is just part of discerning Scripture. One thing that I have to talk about with this book a lot is the Bible comes to us within culture. And so it's going to bear the marks of that time, like slavery, right? Some of the weird expectations and cultural rules that they have, the dress code they have, and all of that. And we as Christians have to discern, right, which part of these are actually part of God's bigger vision and which ones aren't. That's not a conservative liberal issue. That's Christians from the beginning have had to say, some of the stuff in the Bible, like violence, is not actually what God wants. And we have to be able to see what God wants through that.
Yeah, the language I often use when I'm trying to teach that concept is you have to discern what is descriptive and what's prescriptive.
Right.
What is the Bible simply describing as reality in that time, place, and culture? And what is the Bible saying is prescriptive, what we ought to do today? And there's a lot of debate about what exactly falls on which side of those two categories. Toward that end, another part of the book that I really enjoyed, and it's, again, laying the groundwork for what you eventually get to in reading the Gospels and the epistles, is you talk about Roman culture and women in Roman culture. And you affirm completely, which most of us know, that Rome was an incredibly patriarchal society. And yet you say we get a lot of things wrong about what that actually looked like and what it meant. And you unpack a number of myths that we tend to carry about the patriarchal nature of Roman society. So this begins on page 38 of the book. I don't know if you probably have these on the top of your head, but can you start unpacking what are some of the myths that we often tell in our Bible teaching about Roman society and women that we get wrong?
Well, let me talk really quickly about where this comes from. People have asked me why I wrote this book, and there are many reasons. I changed my mind on the issue and what's going on in these days right now, politically and otherwise. I think probably a turning point in terms of my desire to actually put something on paper happened when John MacArthur uttered those two words heard around the world, go home. Right? And
he said that's about Beth Moore.
He said that about Beth Moore. Within a week of that, I wrote an open letter to John MacArthur in the voice of the Apostle Paul. I didn't realize how controversial that was until after. But that open letter was viewed over 40,000 times within a week. And so it really struck a nerve. And things I said to MacArthur, and he never read it, or he didn't tell me he read it. But the things that I said to MacArthur from Paul was, hey, John, I know you have a good heart, but Junia can't go home because she's in prison. Phoebe can't go home because she has to take my letter to the Romans. And Nympha is at home, but she leads a house church, and so forth and so on. The reason I wrote that section of the book is because sometimes we have this Christian mythical nostalgia, like John MacArthur had, where he wants to turn the clock back. Right? But he actually doesn't want to turn the clock back 2,000 years. He actually wants to turn it back to the 1940s. Because the kind of image that he has of the biblical world doesn't reflect the Roman Empire. It actually reflects America in the 1940s. So what I did in the book is try to take us back to the Roman Empire and say, the Roman Empire did have a basic duality of domus and forum, home and public. And on paper and in kind of cultural images, you had the good wife, right? She works in wool, she takes care of the kids, and you have the man out with the briefcase, doing the work in public. But then the reality on the street is you had multiple ways that women could exercise influence inside and outside the house. So, for example, we have women who were of high status that had great power, like the wife of the emperor, or we have this woman named Plancia Magna who was basically a magistrate in the city of Roman Perga. She basically owned the town. Everybody looked up to her. Everybody kissed up to her. She had endless power in this town. How could that happen in this world? We have all this evidence from Pompeii of women of power who were influencing elections, even though they couldn't hold seats of power, who were influencing the business world. So you're talking about these myths. Here's one that's kind of crazy. I read from a Roman historian, Richard Saller, women owned as much as 1/3 of all property in Rome in the first century. That's crazy to think about when we think about the domesticated, dependent woman, and now all of a sudden we have these independent women. We also read that 1 out of every 4 households had a female independent head of household. That starts to change the landscape. What happens when these women become Christians? Do the apostles say, you got to get married, you got to have babies, you got to submit? Is that what happens? Then how do you get a Nympha? How do you get a Phoebe? How do you get a Tryphena and Tryphosa, Euodia and Syntyche?
Right. So, okay, one of the things that you're bringing out here is, on paper, you might say Rome was a patriarchal society and men were a man was the father, head of the household kind of thing. And obviously the emperor was a man and all that. But when you look at it practically, the way it actually gets shaken out, it's way more complicated. And you do a nice job here of articulating the bifurcation of gender roles that happens in Roman society. But what we ignore is the overlay of economic class or social class upon that. So technically, a woman might be under the authority of a man, but if she's a high-ranking woman, she has greater authority than men who are lower-ranking men. Right. And the thought that came to me, and I don't know if you've been back to India much or if you have family there, but this is exactly how Indian society works, at least in the Hindu parts of it that I've engaged in, where it is a patriarchal society, but my goodness, women have an enormous amount of influence if they are of high status. Yep. And all kinds of men will submit to their authority and word because they have more wealth or status or power. And that's a closer example to what Rome probably looked like than what we think about in a 21st century North American context, where we don't think of class structure as hierarchical as other societies do. So go further then into the implications of that when we get to the New Testament, whether in the Gospels and some of the women we see as disciples of Jesus, or especially in Paul's writings and the roles that women clearly had in the early church. How does that map onto what you see in Roman society?
Yeah, what we don't see, I don't think, is the Roman world was, absolutely patriarchal, and the Christians are just trying to get women to make sure they're following suit, both in terms of culture and in terms of, quote unquote, the Bible. What we see is women find ways to kind of slip through the cracks of patriarchy. 2016, 2015, 2016, 2017, you have celebrities like Taylor Swift, young celebrities that are able to influence elections. She has more power, through social media than politicians do through, and I think we see that in the ancient world as well. So what we end up finding is it's not only reasonable, but even demonstrable in Scripture that we have independent women following Jesus and then being affirmed and called and shaped and sent. So you have Mary Magdalene, right, who is with Jesus. I used to think when I was growing up that there were 12 disciples, and that when Jesus makes a reservation at Cheesecake Factory, he's making it for 13, right? And the Gospel of Luke, especially clues us into there's a broader group of people. Not only are there all these women, Luke chapter 8, that are following Jesus, but many of them are independent. And on top of that, they're bringing their money and they're paying for his ministry, right? They're pulling out their Chase Sapphire card when he racks up a bill at the inn. And then Luke talks about the sending of the 70. Where did these 70 people come from? And I found this really interesting. One thing I did in my book was look at patristic discussions. These are theologians in the 3rd, 4th, 5th century who are writing commentaries and theological treatises on various parts of the New Testament. And there's one, actually, I think it was Origen, who says that he thinks that Junia, who's mentioned in Romans 16, Andronicus and Junia, they're called apostles, I believe, and they may have been sent out in the 70. They may have known Jesus personally and represent an earlier era of Christianity than the Apostle Paul himself. When we start to put these pieces together, that there's a Junia out there, there's a Phoebe out there, there's a Nympha, Colossians 4, house church leader out there, Euodia and Syntyche, Lydia, we start to see that women are everywhere and doing the things the men are doing, and they're being sent and commended. That changes the landscape of how we look at women in the New Testament.
So one of the points you make, this is on page 49 of the book, you write that Paul appears to have been a ministry pragmatist.
Yeah.
Those gifted by God and ready to serve with a willing heart are needed for the gospel mission.
Right.
So he enters into a different city. His pattern was to go to the synagogues first until they kicked him out, and then he'd go to the wider Gentile audience. And the pragmatism of his mission meant that if he finds a Lydia who's a merchant in purple cloth and apparently the head of her household who's able to host a church in her home, he's not going to be like, well, no, I need to wait for a man who can. So how does that pragmatism relate then to the way we think about ministry today? How much of this is descriptive and prescriptive, going back to that language I used earlier?
Yeah, I spent a lot of time in my book talking about Romans 16 because I think we learn a lot about early Christianity from just that one chapter. Many Christians gloss over, don't even care much about Romans 16 because it kind of feels like end credits of a movie. It's just a bunch of names. But historians, this is a gold mine. This is like a treasure chest of information. We learn names. We learn some cultural information. We learn who was the first Christian in Europe, and all this stuff. And what's really important about that list is you have, approximately 30 names. About 1/3 of those are women. And it's pretty amazing for Paul or anybody in the ancient world to name that many women in one place in a positive way. I researched a lot. I could not find another list of that kind in the entire ancient world, the Roman world, where you have a list of that many women named at once. And here's what's interesting. You mentioned the pragmatism. Luke Timothy Johnson, New Testament scholar, said, if you covered up the names, you wouldn't know which are men and women by the way that Paul describes them.
Great point.
And that's really important because in the Roman world, you would want to reinforce women should be sweet and charming and loyal and chaste, and men should be brave and tough and strong and good leaders, and you would genderize that. And Paul doesn't genderize his commendation. The most common things he says is that they're co-workers and they worked hard for the Lord. And sometimes just say they worked very hard, which is like a really high commendation. He doesn't say they're super smart. He doesn't say they're gentle or sweet. He might say beloved, which is just his way of saying they're a good friend or I like them a lot. But he just says they work hard. This is like, you really feel good going home at the end of the day if Paul said, Skye works hard for the Lord, right?
And you make the point that Paul's not being innovative here he's being innovative in the sense of the Roman world would not necessarily have done it that way, as you said, but he's not being innovative because there's continuity between the way he operated and what we see in the Gospels and the way Jesus operated. So there's no controversy in the New Testament like there is around, well, can Gentiles be included? And what about circumcision? All that became a big deal. But there's no controversy over Paul including women in his gospel mission because, that's what Jesus did too. We're cool with that.
Not from the apostles' side, but I'm sure there were people in churches that were scoffing or eye-rolling at a woman standing up in front of people. I mean, this is just the world. It happens today, right? It happens today where, people are going to walk out of a church or roll their eyes or say, they're just choosing that person because they're a woman, and, it's to fulfill some sort of diversity quota. I think probably there were people like that in the Roman world and women had to deal with that, that stuff. But you're right that the New Testament across the board affirm women. A good example is, Mary Magdalene at the end of the Gospels, where she's sent to the male disciples who are hiding in back in Galilee. And what's funny, a couple things are funny about that. One is in the Gospel of Luke, we have the angels appear to the women at the tomb and say, why are you confused or why are you crying? Because he said he would suffer and die and rise again, just as he taught you. So these women are actually being taught. And the language of disciple, mathetes, literally means learner who is taught by a didaskalos, a teacher or a rabbi. And what do they call him? They call him teacher. They call him rabbi or Lord, which is another way of saying we're students, you're a teacher. I don't know why the 12 are called the 12. We know that by the time we get to the book of Acts, most of the people in that list disappear. And we have Barnabas. And we have Paul, and we have, women who kind of step up and are starting to, like Priscilla, who are starting to have some impact on the church. But so one thing is interesting is the angels point out that these women have been taught directly by Jesus and are being held responsible. Second is, if you look at the Gospel of John, the story with the beloved disciple and Peter going to see the tomb, that happens before she's sent. Why would they send her when the men have already seen the tomb? And in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus goes and appears to them and he eats bread with them. And in the Gospel of John, he appears to Thomas, says you can look. So he's already proven it. So why is he sending the woman? He's really investing in her, and he's kind of knighting her in some way. He's saying, this is going to be important for your discipleship, Mary. You need to do this. And it's important for them to see you do it.
Okay.
There was no functional reason that had to happen that way.
So two things before we have to wrap up here. And I spent too much time probably talking to you about, our
therapy.
Yes, our therapy session at the beginning there. First of all, I didn't say this earlier, but what an excellent book for people who are trying to get their heads around what does the scripture actually say about the role of women in the church. We've had scholars on to talk about some of this before. Beth Allison Barr does an excellent job in her book on biblical womanhood about looking at the larger historical trajectory of this whole thing throughout Christian history. But for a super accessible read on what the Bible actually says, your book, Tell Her Story, is just excellent. Secondly, just the end of the book, the last 20, 30 pages is worth the price of admission. And I want you to stick around for a bonus segment because we're going to talk about some of that. In that last section of the book, you do a deep dive into the household codes and especially 1 Timothy 2 about women remaining silent and not having quote unquote authority over men, which are the texts that complementarians always go to. And you do a masterful job of unpacking what's really being debated in those texts and why scholars disagree about it and how to understand it. So if you stick around for a bonus segment, we're going to do that for our Holy Post supporters. Again, just buy the book for that section alone. It's so well done. But the whole book is super accessible. Nijay Gupta, thank you so much for being with us. We'll definitely have you back as you continue to produce this kind of great material for the church. So thank you so much.
My pleasure.
The Holy Post podcast is a production of Holy Post Media. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by supporting us at patreon.com/Holy Post. Also, be sure to leave a review on iTunes so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary, plus ukulele, and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, Holy Post merchandise, and much more.